Welcome to Moneyweb at Midday, the actuality news show, offering unique insights and in-depth analysis featuring South Africa's top business leaders, newsmakers, and analysts for today's professionals. Your host, Jeremy Maggs.
Hello, and thank you for listening to Moneyweb at Midday. In the next 30 minutes, I'll put some context around the numbers, some perspective around the politics, and some clarity around the choices facing us in South Africa. A warm welcome. I'm Jeremy Maggs. Coming up on the program today, a fake CV, a pension fight, and a former chief financial officer facing the consequences. New franchising rules have been proposed, and the fallout could reshape a trillion-rand industry. Teachers are quitting public schools in their thousands, but who will be left to teach the next generation? And you went in for bread and milk, so why did you leave with a full trolley? It's Friday, the 17th of July. Now, can your pension money be frozen before you have been convicted of any crime? Let me give you the background. A former Robben Island Museum chief financial officer has lost a bid to have a withdrawal benefit of around 390,000 rand released after his employer alleged that he misrepresented his professional status when applying for the job. Now, the pension fund's adjudicator, Lebogang Mogashua, found that there was enough initial evidence of possible dishonesty to justify withholding the benefit while legal processes continue. The ruling did not find the former employee guilty of fraud or confirm the employer's claimed losses. So let's explore this in a little more detail. Lebogang, a very warm welcome to you. So explain to us in simple terms, how can a pension fund freeze someone's money before a court has found the person guilty?
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy, and thank you for the opportunity. Jeremy, I think the point of departure should be that your retirement savings that you save in a retirement fund are safeguarded from being pursued by your creditors or anyone who claims to have a claim against you. The law says that they cannot pursue your pension benefit because it's protected. But in the same breath, the law does say that in certain circumstances, it is allowed for someone who has a claim against you, such as your employer, to pursue the recovery of damage that they may have suffered as a result of your conduct from your pension. So that's the legal provision. And from that, the law says that the employer, or whoever has a claim against you, if it's the employer cannot recover the loss that they suffered or they are alleged to have suffered from your pension, except if they obtain a judgment of court that determines that you're liable to compensate them, or if you've written down or acknowledged liability to the employer in writing. And this is where the issue of freezing the pension comes in now, because usually these legal processes, whether trying to get an acknowledgement of liability or trying to get liability determined by the courts, can take years and years. So the law allows a pension fund to then withhold the money that you have in your pension pending the outcome of those proceedings. And this is exactly what is happening here. The employee's pension has been frozen because there are legal proceedings that are unfolding to determine their liability to the employer.
In pure legal terms, though, Lebogang, does that not undermine the presumption of innocence?
It doesn't, because as you correctly pointed out when you introduced this matter, the withholding of the benefit does not mean that the employee has been found guilty. It just says that the employer has provided sufficient initial evidence that there might have been wrongdoing and that it might have a valid claim. And therefore, we are keeping the money, we're freezing the money, we're not paying it out, so that in the event that it is determined that the employee is liable to the employer, then the employer has an option to recover it from the pension. So it's not a presumption that the employee is guilty of anything.
Let me ask you about determination then. What level of evidence would an employer have to produce before a fund could withhold a benefit?
So in legal terms, we call it prima facie evidence. So in simple terms, it just means that present credible, believable evidence. Not necessarily conclusive evidence, but believable. It must be believable on the face of it that the employer has suffered loss as a result of theft, fraud, dishonesty, or misconduct. And it's very important that I clarify for the listeners that the employer, it's not a carte blanche, so the employer is not entitled to recover money from a pension for just anything. It must be for loss suffered as a result of theft, fraud, dishonesty, or misconduct. And the courts have said that the misconduct that's envisaged in that section that we're referring to is one that has an element of dishonesty. So it's not just a general misconduct. There must be dishonesty, and it must have caused the employer loss, or there must be believable evidence that it might have caused the employer loss.
In this particular case that I referenced, is there a line between an inaccurate CV and deliberate fraud?
Yes, there is a clear connection in this matter, because essentially what the employer was saying is that the employee misrepresented their qualifications. They said they were a chartered accountant, and they were saying that the qualifications for this job that had been advertised, which the employer applied for, required a chartered accountant registered with SICA. And therefore, the employee misrepresented their qualifications, and they then were appointed, they were paid salaries on that basis, and there were issues around the quality of the work that the employee has done, and the issues that arose around compliance, irregular expenditure, etc., that arose there. So there's clearly a line that the employee has is alleged to have misrepresented their qualifications, and that qualifies as dishonesty under Section 37D, as the determination says.
And how long would the benefit have to be frozen before the delay becomes unfair?
So it's not an immutable period. There's no fixed period that says a benefit must be withheld for this long, and beyond that it becomes unreasonable. What the trustees need to do is to show that, is to make sure that they follow up with the employer, make sure that the employer pursues its case without any delay. Because if there are delays in the prosecution of whatever claim the employer claims to have against the employee, and those delays can be pinned on the employer, then continuing to withhold the benefit then becomes unfair to the employee. And then in those cases, the benefit might have to be released. But if the employer is doing all it can to expedite the resolution or the prosecution of the claim, then that benefit can be withheld until the determination or the outcome of the proceedings.
Is there anything that prevents an employer from using a pension freeze as leverage in a labour or personal dispute?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way the law is framed, so the relevant section is Section 37D of the Pension Funds Act. The way it's framed ensures that it's not, as I said, it's not carte blanche. So employer cannot just say, because I have a personal grievance against this employee, I'm just going to withhold. Because the requirements for the withholding are very clear. The law says that there must be a loss, so the employer has to show that at least there's evidence that it has suffered some loss, and that loss arose as a result of the employee's theft, fraud, dishonesty, or misconduct. And this is where a lot of claims collapse, by the way, because the employer withholds for something else that's not theft, fraud, dishonesty, or misconduct. And there are cases where we found that the reasons for withholding were unlawful and therefore ordered the release of the money. But as long as the employer can show that there's been loss and that it arises from theft, fraud, dishonesty, or misconduct, then that withholding would be lawful.
And just a final one, what warning do you think this ruling sends to employees, employers and retirement funds who might be handling similar disputes?
I think the most important message from this determination is that, as I said, there must be loss that arises from theft, fraud, dishonesty, or misconduct. But the scope of what qualifies as theft, fraud, dishonesty, or misconduct is something that is quite interesting and is not always clear. And as far as I can recall, I've not seen a case, at least since I've been at the PFA, where the fraud or the dishonesty that the employee alleges, or that is alleged by the employer or the fund, is in relation to qualifications. So the important thing is that lying about your qualifications will not only cost you your career, but it can also cost you your pension, depending on the other facts and circumstances of the case.
Thank you very much indeed. That is Lebogang Mogashua, who is the pension funds adjudicator.
You're listening to Moneyweb at midday.
Now, this is one big industry. South Africa's franchise sector generates something in the region of R1 trillion a year and supports around 500,000 jobs. But I see the Competition Commission is asking whether its funding models, contracts and ownership structures are shutting out smaller and historically disadvantaged operators. Its proposed market inquiry is going to examine everything from the requirement that franchisees provide large amounts of their own capital to supplier arrangements, royalties, pricing controls and potentially unrealistic financial projections. It's a big issue, and I'm going to talk now to Mark Thomas, who's legal director at the law firm Pinsent Masons. Mark, welcome. Thank you very much indeed. So is the franchise model as it exists fundamentally unfair to franchisees, or do you think the Competition Commission might be looking for a problem that simply doesn't exist?
You know, Jeremy, that's a tough question. I mean, that's going to be the exact question that's going to play out over the next 18 months. And it's going to be a tough one. The Commission has a very difficult task that they've inherited economy that they have to look at that is competitive. They have to make sure it's inclusive, but there are structural models within our economy that need to be questioned and look at to ensure that it's inclusive and that it's structured correctly. So there's going to be a lot of legal debate and a lot of commercial debate. And I think just one more thing I want to mention on that. You mentioned it's the franchise market, but what's unique about this inquiry is that they're actually looking at a business model as well. So it's going to be an interesting interplay between economics, commercial law, and actual legality.
The Commission, as I understand it, is questioning requirements that applicants provide around half of the investment from their own unencumbered funds. That is a lot of money for many people. Mark, what's the conventional wisdom here? Is it an unreasonable barrier or maybe just sensible protection for franchisors and, I guess, the banks, the lenders themselves?
Very good commercial question, very good economics question. I mean, lenders, we know, don't like uncertainty. They look at risk profiles and they basically want the franchisees to have some skin in the game. You know, if I'm going to buy a franchise, I'm going to put up 50% of the capital. They know that I'm committed, that I've put in some sweat equity and some skin. But the problem with that is I may not have access to those funds. It's a lot of money. So are there alternative models available? And that's what they need to be looking at. And they need to be looking at their risk profiles. How do they assess individuals?
So we might ask the question whether banks should lower their lending standards to broaden ownership. All well and good. But obviously, Mark, that increases the risk of failure and of more concern to banks' unpaid loans.
Well, yes and no. So that's what they're going to have to look at. They're going to be some very clever economists looking at that. Do you really need 50% up front? Perhaps, maybe not. Is there any other surety or security you can take? Are there other forms, security indemnity, or things like that? Are there other options available? And the financial institutions and lenders really need to be looking at these models and asking, especially in the modern day and age, with South Africa's economy and the climate, are there other ways to do it? I mean, 50% upfront cash is king, fantastic. But what other options are there? And that's going to be a bit of horizon scanning and re-looking at your financial models, looking at your franchise agreements and seeing how that's structured. How else can we structure it is really going to be a key question that plays out.
You also argue, and explain this to me, that lenders must stress test their franchise exposure. What do you think banks are underestimating?
There are going to be questions. There will be no doubt of that. There will be questions. In 18 months' time, there's going to be a report that comes out that's going to make certain findings. Those are just indicators of what the Commission believes the state of play to be. But those findings are going to be wide, very broad-ranging. We've seen it in the past, susceptible to legal challenge. But the problem is there will be these findings, and it's going to say, we think this is problematic, we think this should be divested, we think this model is problematic. Now, just from a good corporate citizen point of view, from a compliance point of view, you need to start looking at your franchise agreements at the moment, your lending models at the moment, see what international best practices are. I mean, this isn't the first time something like this has happened. We've seen it happen in the States, we've seen it happen in the EU, where the regulators look at this. You know, what happened in those jurisdictions? How can you better prepare for in 18 months when that report comes out?
Let's get into the weeds of all of this quickly if we can. As I understand it, franchisees sometimes complain that they are forced to buy stock from approved suppliers or participate in advertising or promotion that damage their margins. Again, would the inquiry look at legitimate brand control becoming an abuse of power? Because that seems to be the constant refrain, particularly from smaller, more vulnerable franchisees.
I think that's a very, very good point, Jeremy. And I think that's what's going to be interesting about this market inquiry. It's going to create a ripple effect across the entire value chain. So we've touched on the big banks, we've touched on the finances, but now we're talking about the smaller guys, talking about the franchisees. You may be able to find your product somewhere cheaper, right? So let's just say batteries. We'll just use that, car batteries as a nice example. You can get it from a big supplier, and you're the franchisor for that big supplier, and you know you've got the brand. You've got the brand behind you. That's why people come to you. They really like that brand. But if you're a small independent, you could really go shopping around from anywhere and get a car battery imported from somewhere else, perhaps at a cheaper price. So the question is, why are you tied into that car battery? Well, it's the name, it's the brand, it's the accountability. So that's part of the deal that you're making, right? You say, I'm going to be a franchisor or franchisee for you because I know I've got the brand support. But the other side of the coin is there may be certain dynamics of that entire supply chain that don't actually work for you and could hamper you. You could get batteries cheaper from somewhere else, sell those, but now you're precluded from doing so.
It's an interesting example, but we also need to talk about customer expectation here. And you are going to that franchise because you have an expectation, surely, of quality and consistency.
Well, that's it. That's the deal you strike. So you want to be a franchisee for that battery company. That's the deal you strike. You're going to take that battery, that brand, that product, and go to market with it. And you don't then have to worry about backing the product because it's got the big reputation behind it. So that's the deal you're striking.
Just a final one then. I know we are at the beginning of this process, and I suspect this process is also going to take a long time. Have you applied your mind to a single reform that might effectively broaden ownership without damaging investment?
So, the way we've been looking at it is by looking at international case studies and seeing how those have been dealt with in other jurisdictions. So this inquiry, the Commission is not going to be bound by what's happened in other jurisdictions, but it's certainly going to look at it for certain guidance. And I think we can expect that there will be certain findings and recommendations about divestiture, recommendations and findings about the systemic change of reaction, particularly around marketing, promotion materials, input supply, distribution agreements. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out, but there's not going to be a simple answer to it.
Mark Thomas, thank you very much indeed. He's the legal director at the law firm Pinsent Masons.
Moneyweb at midday for all your up-to-date stories.
South Africa's teacher retention crisis is not only an education problem, it does threaten the country's future skills base, productivity, and the ability then to grow the economy. And I just want to focus on these numbers, and they're worrying. 32,000 teachers reportedly leaving public schools between 2020 and 2024 amid concerns about crime, overcrowding, inadequate resources, and rising administrative pressure. But how many were replaced, and what will the cost of losing experienced educators eventually cost employers and then ultimately the economy? I want to discuss this with Ruben Maleka, who is General Manager of the Public Servants Association. Ruben, welcome to you. What's your reading of this situation? Is it a genuine teacher exodus, or is it more just normal workforce turnover? 32,000 is a high number.
Look, this is a crisis in the education sector, particularly for the public schools. It's going to be a brain drain for public schools, and there's also going to be robbing of public school learners of a better education. Many of teachers leave the public schools, as you indicated, for various reasons, amongst others, crime, lack of resources, and also because there is no support of government when it comes to the teaching professionals in the public schools. We know that where we are sitting today, to replace a teacher is a mission. Many of the previous teachers' colleges have closed down. So we can even see that in some instances, many of the especially specialized subjects, accounting, maths, and science, we ultimately even have to import teachers from neighboring countries. So it is a crisis that requires an immediate attention by the Department of Basic Education, to an extent also by the higher education, because without a proper enough training of teachers, it is not going to be adequate to even replace the lost 32,000, which is obviously those who goes into are recruited by the private schools.
I'm just wondering whether the PSA has crunched the numbers and whether you're able to determine the biggest shortages by province and also subject. You did reference maths and science.
Look, we know, although not immediate that I have the statistics, but we all know where we are sitting because we've got teachers in the space where we recruit that are members of the PSA. And it has always been proven that, especially public schools, there's the teacher ratio is worse. You find the schools are overcrowded because there are few teachers that should actually be able to they share the learners according to the ratios that are required in terms of the norms and standards. And we are sitting with a crisis where the classes are overcrowded, and which makes hamper actually learning and teaching, because if you find there are over 60 to 100 learners in a classroom that should be sitting 35 learners, already itself is a hazardous. It's also against occupational health and safety. So how do you manage as a teacher also to be teaching so many learners over the number, even 100% of what's supposed to be the learners in a one classroom? So it is a crisis that requires an immediate attention, so that we all know, it has been reported this week that South Africa, we are sitting with a crisis of future skills and professionals that should actually be taking over positions. And we ultimately have to import also lately skills elsewhere, because it starts from the school, and that's where the problem is.
Ruben, I want to try and make the link between the crisis that you're outlining for me and the South African economy. And obviously, the loss of experienced teachers has a negative effect on learner performance, and that has a detrimental long-term impact on South Africa's future skills pipeline, again, with particular reference to mathematics and science.
Absolutely. And that is where, as PSA, I think we've made a call for a long time that, there should be consideration by government to reopen, teacher training colleges. And to an extent, there must be an improvement of conditions of teachers, especially in the public schools. Because recently, Jeremy, you are aware, there have been reports about teachers being attacked by the public. Some, they lost their lives in the schools. Some are even attacked by the learners themselves within the schools, because there is no attention to safety within the schools. Because, reports have been all around in Tembisa, where learners have access to dangerous weapons and they bring those in the environment of the school. So how does a teacher become safe in the instance of a classroom environment when you've got a learner that is armed, you've got a learner that is having a dangerous weapon within the environment? Those are the issues that requires immediate attention. We should not only blame the issue of the department itself. I think the parents must also come into play, because it is our kids that leaves our homes with dangerous weapons without our care.
Right.
And it becomes a threat to the whole school.
But Ruben, it's also a question of priority, and it's difficult to determine what is most important. With limited budgets, should government then be prioritizing teachers, security, as you've just pointed out to me, or broad infrastructure, which in so many instances is collapsing?
Look, the fact is that at this point in time, education requires immediate attention. Priority should be made to make school safe, to make teachers be retained, so that they don't, have that issue of being recruited elsewhere and leave the public schools. Because the more a teacher comes into a space of a public school, teaches for 4 or 5 years and become experienced, and they have to leave, then it is not only the learners that will suffer, as you pointed out, the general consequence of it in the near future, that we don't have the required competencies and learners that are able to enter the market and grow the economy. So because it starts from the school to university and ultimately, generally, the effect of the economy as South Africans.
I'll just need a quick answer as we end this conversation. Has the PSA done any work on what an effective teacher retention strategy would cost?
Look, I can, on top of my head, that, on monthly basis, we do researches. And amongst the research that we've been doing was around the issue of education. And we have, in fact, many times even contributed whenever there's amendment to legislation, and particularly on education, to say that we want and we believe that, if South Africa needs to grow its economy, if South Africa needs to be competent enough in the market, it starts from the schools. It starts with having teachers that can be retained and be able to teach in a very safe environment where they can be able to produce learners that can compete in the world.
Ruben Maleka, thank you very much indeed. You are the General Manager of the Public Servants Association. Thank you very much.
You're listening to Moneyweb at Midday.
So you went in to buy bread and milk and somehow you left with a full trolley of items. Retailers these days are using everything from store layouts and music to loyalty points and limited time specials to persuade us to spend more. But we've got to ask, I guess, are these simply clever sales techniques or are shoppers being deliberately manipulated at a time when household budgets are already under pressure? Let's explore this in a little more detail. Erica Liebenberg is with us. She's been with us on the program before. She's from the financial wellness platform Just Money. So, Erica, welcome to you. So, are shoppers these days making free choices, or is the suggestion here retailers are manipulating us into spending more?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of both. South Africans are certainly savvy, that they're quite resilient and smart and increasingly tech savvy, but there's no question that retailers are using tricks to get us to try to spend more.
Is there an ethical line then between clever marketing on the one hand and deliberate exploitation?
Yes, yeah. And it can seem like a very fine line in a way, with household budgets being as tight as they are right now, some of these subtle psychological nudges can actually border on being quite aggressive and manipulative. And, if we look at it from the retailer's perspective, they are competing for a limited share of wallet, so that's turned things like loyalty programs into absolutely essential tools. But even with that, that requires a trade-off in personal data. But if we look to some of the tricks and techniques that are used, it's clear that fine line is getting quite blurred in some instances.
So you use the terms aggressive and manipulative. Can you cite an instance that worries you particularly?
For me, I think dark patterns. So those user interfaces that we see in e-tail environments, things like pre-checking boxes for optionals like warranties. Those kinds of things are quite manipulative. And also the kind of language that's used sometimes, things like, no thanks, I prefer paying full price is given as an option. No one prefers paying full price, or some of the sneaky tactics to try and get your email for aggressive marketing techniques. So, those dark patterns, but also I think decoy pricing and price anchoring. And, what we mean by that, of course, is where there's an original price given, but that original price is fake. The product never retailed for that price. And next to it, of course, is this fabulous sale price. So that sort of, and we're all trying to save money, so that sort of tricks you into signing up, if you like. So I think those two, along with this idea of urgency or scarcity, countdown timers or low stock warnings, and some of those low stock warnings are real, but some of them really are not. And those are some of the e-commerce tactics that I find a bit cheeky. From a retail perspective, it's quite interesting actually, because the cues are so subtle. When we hear what's being done, it's an aha moment in a sense, but we don't realize. It's things like, if you think about when you enter a retail store, it's always got a counterclockwise flow. And I think it's possibly something we've never really thought about, but that's our natural physical reaching and visual tracking pattern. So retailers know that. Stock that's placed at eye level, those high margin, expensive products, they're at eye level, but you've got to search around for the more basic items.
Erica, I accept all of that, but on the other hand, consumers do have agency. We don't have to fall for any of this. We can simply go in, buy what we want, produce our card and leave, can't we?
Absolutely. And in fact, there's a few tips, and those are two very good tips in terms of avoiding these subtle cues. We do have agency, and, South Africans are savvy. It's things like, making sure that you've got a list and don't head out when you're hungry, because I think that's a big one, or you're tired or stressed. look at the unit price. If you have a look, you can often see price per 100 gram, which can make can help you make a proper comparison. And then pausing before an impulse purchase, having a think about it, because all of these tricks, they're very subtle in many instances. There's some obvious ones where we could all roll our eyes and say, I'm not going to be taken in by that. But some of the more subtle ones can be difficult to avoid. But if you have a list, if you know your prices, and really it's so easy to know our prices these days with all of the supermarkets in particular being online, we can compare between apps. Then you're so much less likely to be taken in. Even these sort of tricks where they put the staples right at the end of the store, so you've got to wander through all of the other aisles before you get to them. It's going to be much less of a temptation for you if you're in there with a list. You know what you're looking for. You're not going to be taken in.
Do you think there is potentially a matrix of demographic risk? And by that I mean, are lower income shoppers more vulnerable to the tactics that you're outlining simply because they have less room for financial mistakes?
Absolutely. In that respect, they absolutely are. I think, where there's a stricter budget, it can actually help us to the extent that we know, for example, I'm here to get the basics. My budget is not going to stretch. So all of those luxury items that are placed at eye level, all of those 3 for 2 promotions and those kinds of things that are meant to entice us are less of an enticement, I think, when we know that there's just no way that's going to fit within the plan that we've got. But exactly as you say, if we do fall prey to some of the more subtle tactics, there's just no margin for error. So to that extent, absolutely.
You mentioned the positioning of certain items in stores, and that's very evident to all of us. Do you think that, for instance, placing sweets and toys at a child's eye level is an unacceptable form of pressure on parents? Because we've all seen that, haven't we?
Yes, and yes. I do feel it's extremely unfair because kids, it's all about instant gratification. They're small, they haven't learned yet, they don't understand. So, and actually one of the tips is try to shop alone if you can, because anything that adds to your level of pressure and stress is more likely to encourage you, in a sense, to make a mistake, because now you're rushed, you're frustrated, so yes, it is an unfair tactic, and it is absolutely a stock standard tactic that the shops use. As much as they put, the expensive products at adult eye level, there is no question that there's an enticement and, a intentional enticement towards kids, and kids don't need that additional push. Once we get to the checkout and we go through the checkout line, there's all those temptations for us, let alone kids. And it makes things that much harder.
Erica Liebenberg, thank you very much indeed, from the financial wellness platform Just Money. And that is our program for today and, in fact, for the week. You've been listening to Moneyweb at midday, and we are here every weekday at noon with the latest in current affairs, the economy and policy. You can always catch the podcast version a little later. Thank you for making us part of your day. Until next time, goodbye.
Listen to the daily live stream of Moneyweb at midday or download episodes on moneyweb.co.za, the Moneyweb app, Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or follow Moneyweb News on social media for more updates. Moneyweb, your trusted source for business and investment insights.